whose articles have appeared in many of the nation's most respected newspapers and publications. Recently, he authored a paper for the Cato Institute, which was titled "The Failure of Federal Job Training." And that's what we would like to discuss tonight. Good to see you, Jim.
That's nice to be back, Fred.
Jim was just telling me about a trip to Europe that he had just made, and it sounds great.
Well, I managed to stay out of jail. That's the important thing.
How'd you travel around Europe?
Oh, by train, mostly. Just knocking around.
And can we look forward to a series of articles concerned with the trip, or
well,
related to the trip?
There'll be a series of them. I'm not quite sure where they'll be appearing, but there's some good stories there.
Jim, for over half a century now, we've had more than 50 different federal employment programs, and you charge in this paper that you did that none of them has been worthwhile, and some of them have actually been harmful. That's a pretty stiff criticism.
Well, I hate to sound cynical. I've gone back and read a lot of the General Accounting Office evaluations, a lot of the private evaluations. There was recently a National Academy of Science overall study of the youth employment programs, and again and again and again we found these programs. They found these programs did not help the poor. They often hurt the poor. There was a lot of negative effects with CETA. CETA being the largest program in the 1970s, up to about 1981. The government spent $53 billion on that program, yet some recent evaluations by some moderate to liberal think tanks showed that across the board for young men who enrolled in CETA, there were significant earning losses, and they had no significant effects on young women.
The people who are enrolled in the CETA training programs actually earned less than people who are not enrolled in it?
Right, that the net effect of CETA was negative on these on millions of male enrollees of all races in this program. Now that's a pretty damning thing. You know, I was expecting that it would not do much good, but it surprised even me that moderate.
I don't know how they can arrive at that sort of thing, because I suspect that those people who become involved in programs like CETA or other federal employment programs are people who have more difficulty finding jobs in the private sector, of selling themselves, maybe, and consequently of commanding higher salaries. It may be that when they get jobs later on, they're unable to get higher salaries for those reasons, but not because they were in CETA.
Okay, but what happens with these studies is that the sociologists or whatever take a control group and the group that enrolls in CETA, and they try and match the situation in both groups. And there's all kinds of ways of doing this, and most of the time there's a bias in favor of the group in the program, I think. Mm-hmm. But in these cases, in very major studies by the Urban Institute and some other major think tanks, they found a negative effect.
You say over $50 million has been spent? $53 billion, is that what you said?
$53 billion on CETA, over $100 billion on these programs overall.
Oh. So CETA, more than half of the total amount of money that's been spent in the last 50 years or so on employment programs went into CETA.
Well, I'm not sure the total amount, maybe 120, 130, I'm not sure what it is, but a very large proportion is CETA.
I was reading your paper, and you refer to the WPA, of course. That's probably the granddaddy of the employment programs, right?
Yes, one of the...
And I recall, my memory goes back, that far, and I recall the jokes that were made and the outrage about the waste. But from the perspective of years now, looking back, there are a great many people who are praising the program.
Who?
Well, I've read all kinds of articles and heard economists discussing it, and who feel that what it did it helped build roads. It was of substantial value to the arts in our country. Many and to theater and to water supply problems and so on. Same sort of thing is true of the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Yeah, okay,
Looking back, it seemed to have been of value.
And okay, wait a minute, but it's important to think clearly on this. The question is, what were the costs, what were the benefits? With WPA, they intentionally tried to have the most labor-intensive projects possible. It's the same thing. There was a CETA publication in 1979 that suggested using CETA workers for labor-intensive snow removal, the same way they do in Peking. In other words, instead of taking a tractor and clearing out a city plaza, get 100 cedar workers out there with shovels and have all of them keep busy doing it. That's the same thing you had with WPA. They were all out there keeping busy, and I think there were even some people, some WPA project supervisors that bragged about how they would have the men have one group of men dig trenches, have the other group come in there and fill in the trenches. The first group would come back and dig them out again. I mean, that was their idea of beneficial labor.
Well, the point is it was undertaken as an emergency measure during a very, very severe depression, the worst depression this nation had. And obviously there was considerable amount of waste, and some of them, the things were not worthwhile. Other things turned out to have been worthwhile, but it kept large numbers of people doing something. It provided them with a minimal amount of money and gave them a modicum of self-respect. And, those are things that a government has to consider.
Well, there's a flip side. At the same time that Roosevelt was launching the WPA, he was also raising taxes on individuals, on businesses. He was cracking down on business activity. He was pushing through all kinds of new regulations on small and large businesses both, which would greatly impede private job creation at the same time. And it doesn't make much sense to have this huge government program to create jobs at the same time that you're crushing the private sector's ability to create jobs, which is what Roosevelt did throughout the 1930s.
Well, I wish that my first guest tonight, who is an economist with the TRW Corporation, had been able to stay over. He's done his name is Pat Choate, and he, in fact, argues that this relationship between taxation and the creation of jobs is nonsense, and that's one of the reasons for which the supply-siders were wrong. It hasn't worked. It's discredited, and there's no reason to believe that Roosevelt's raising of taxes against business, and there really was minimal, because there was no business. Business was suffering like everybody else, impeded our recovery.
Wait a minute. But keep in mind that in Europe, America recovered from the Depression far slower than Europe did. I think a primary reason was because of Roosevelt's policies. There was a very anti-business atmosphere. His National Recovery Act put regulations on every nickel and dime thing businesses could possibly do. There was this incredible nonsense there. At the same time, he kept raising taxes sharply every single year. And as far as there's no correlation between the tax rates and job creation now, I think there's an awful lot of studies to disprove that. And if you want a self-evident proof, just look at Europe. Taxes are very high there, and in Germany, France, and Britain, I think they haven't created hardly a single new net job since 1980.
Well, their economies happen to be getting along with far fewer problems than ours. And
I fully disagree. And I would think that most Europeans would disagree, because they've got 10% unemployment, 12% unemployment.
Well, their cycle, and their unemployment cycle is a little different from ours, but their productivity is up. Their standard of living is higher than it's ever been. Their plants are far more modern than ours.
No. Wait a
okay.
Fred.
You say you've heard of Mr. Choate. He's a highly respected economist. These are things that he was arguing. Here's his book that you can read them in. And I guess maybe his view on that may be given somewhat greater weight than yours or mine, Jim.
Well, but the question is not how much weight his view is given. The question is his view right? And as far as Europeans being far more modern than us, a key thing in Europe that I noticed being there was that there was very little enthusiasm for computers. A single example, the governments there are not nearly as pro-innovation as they are here, pro-technology. For instance, in Germany, it's very difficult, very expensive to acquire an answering machine for your phone line. Here, you can go out and buy one for $50. There, it costs 2 or 3, 4, 5 times as much, and there's much more of a nursance.
I don't know anything about that. I'm talking about production technology. I'm talking about automation, about the modernization of productive capacity.
Well, but it's a key thing in Europe. The Europeans are not catching on to computers. The Europeans are far behind the computer revolution. And since they're behind in that, that's 2/3 of the ball game, I think, for the rest of the 20th century. And as far as European cars, I think Ford is catching up very quickly as far as car quality. And aside from BMW and Mercedes, well, the rest of the European cars are not in the same class as Japanese cars.
Well, what is that indicating?
Well, I'm just saying that I had the impression you were saying there was a blanket superiority of European manufacturing to American manufacturing.
I said nothing of that sort.
Well, it was implicit in what you were saying.
All right, let's come back to our
Very good. Yeah.
to our study of federal job training program. You concentrate on what you call the modern era, which started in 1961.
Right.
And you call it the area. What is it?
The Area Redevelopment Act, Administration Act.
Yeah.
ARA. Yeah, that was launched in '61. That was one of Kennedy's plans to try and help boost the poor areas in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Appalachia. Like most of these programs, a total failure. Let's see. A lot of people they were trying to train were not interested in learning a new trade. As its first annual report observed, one of the most serious obstacles was the fact that job opportunities in these areas were limited because there was a long-term economic decline. And you had with this program what you've had ever since then. You've got government going in and training people for jobs that don't exist. There's two problems in these programs. First, the training the government offers is usually very poor quality. And second, even when it is good quality, most of the time the government is training people for jobs that don't exist.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I guess it's because they bring in instructors who are, whose experience, whose background in industry or whatever is old.
Yeah. You get the same thing somewhat.
They don't have access to modern equipment. My brother, who was an educator in industrial arts, said one of the great problems of our vocational schools in this country is that they all have outdated equipment. People who go to vocational schools don't work on the newest equipment, and when they get out of, they're unable to get jobs because they don't know the newest equipment. And I guess the federal job training programs have had the same problems.
Yeah, there are some training programs that are not like that. Some good private training programs, but most of these government programs are just doing a bad job of teaching people old skills.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't you say a few words about the program that I think most people in this area have read about very, very recently, or maybe have had some experience with, and it's the Summer Youth Employment Program.
The last time I commented on that program here, there was a rash of calls questioning my decency.
Sanity?
Questioning my decency. But, I'll call it as I see it. Summer Youth Program is one of the most popular programs. It's been around since 1964, 65. It's always very popular with mayors. In Washington, D.C., it's always the big sign is Mayor Barry has a job for you. It's always has a smell of a pork barrel about it. The program is basically a federal slush fund for mayors. The only real requirements for the program is that it pay minimum wages and try not to lose the money. Here in D.C., the program's almost always a boondoggle. There's some people that benefit from it here, but I think most people enrolled in the program, it's had marginal or bad effects. The General Accounting Office study a few years ago concluded that almost 3 of every 4 urban enrollees were exposed to work site where good work habits were not learned, or realistic ideas or on expectations in the real world of work were not fostered. In other words, the most important government audit found that these programs were giving kids bad work habits.
And bad work habits? You mean they weren't expected to report on time or things like that?
Yeah, kids are often paid even if they don't show up. Kids are paid. They just kind of show up and stand around there. And that's called a job. There was controversy in the Post, I think, in August. Some kids were complaining that instead of having a job to do, they just had to sit there and listen to lectures all day on South African nuclear war. I mean, if that's not a waste of the kids' time, and it's especially criminal when kids are told that this is a job, this is work, and handed a paycheck for it. I think it'd be much less harmful just to give the kid a check and not give him any false conception of work.
Well, what is your criticism? Is your criticism that we have a program at all, or that we do it the wrong way?
Well, from looking at these programs, from looking hundreds of evaluations of these programs, I find it difficult to conceive that we could have a program that would work well. I think there's no way you can get politicians that are in charge, politicians that are controlling the program, and bureaucrats that are running it to respect the imperatives of the private sector. We've had Reagan, we've had a lot of other politicians that say, now this new program is going to pay attention to the private sector. It's all rhetoric. I don't think it's possible to do.
Now, there's one that was undertaken in the Reagan administration, right?
Yeah, the Job Training Partnership Act, which is Reagan often brags on, he claims it has a 68% placement rate of its graduates, but that's utter nonsense. The people at Labor Department are feeding him feeding stuff to him with a shovel. The 68% number is typical. For the last 25 years, these programs have justified themselves by playing with numbers. The 68% figure is a good example of this. The 68% figure comes from each state comes up with its own number, and each state reaches its number differently, and then all the numbers are added together and treated like they're the same number. For instance, in some states, if a person enrolls in the program and then drops out, the person is treated as if he never existed as far as the program is concerned, as far as measuring success. And in many states, if a person is in training, a Job Training Partnership Act, federal training for 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, and then gets a job for a single day, he's counted as employed. It doesn't matter if he's fired after the first hour of the day or fired on day 2. He's counted as employed because of the program. And Reagan goes and says 68% success rate. That's nonsense.
Well, Jim, what is the conclusion that you reach? There are a great many economists in this country, a great many social scientists who are concerned about the future because we are entering in very rapidly into a high-tech era in which the jobs will require people to have training. We have a very serious problem now of unemployment, particularly among young people, particularly among minorities. We have dislocations of various sorts which really threaten the economic stability and health of the nation. Should we deal with these problems at all? And if we are going to deal with them, doesn't the government have some role in it, given the size and importance of it?
Well, to the first point you made, that we're entering into a high-tech era, government has shown its, looking at these programs for 25 years, government has shown its inability to train people to be carpenters or to be ditch diggers or almost anything. Government just does a poor job of training, and it's infinitely harder to train someone to be work on computers than it is to work as a ditch digger. And if government can't do the latter, then it certainly can't do the former.
How much training does it take to be a ditch digger?
Well, it takes good work habits, and that's something people don't get from government training programs. People rarely get from government training. There are exceptions, but in general, these programs, the study after study after study, both inside and outside the government, says they have an adverse effect on work habits. And that's the most crucial thing. For most
that raises the
young
question
workers.
about, whether we're not doing it right, whether there's a way in which the government can do it properly, or should we abandon, any action at all, leaving open the door to really dire consequences.
What dire consequences? Well, hold on.
Wide-scale
Wait,
unemployment, economic distress, losing a competitive edge to other governments around the world, the sorts of things that I was talking to Pat Choate about earlier this evening.
Well, the funny thing is, I see all these dire consequences, but I assume that, we've had all these huge programs in the past, and then they've generally had marginal or bad results, hurting people's earnings powers. I can't imagine why, if we had programs that were doing us harm in the past, and we didn't have any programs harming us in the future, that we'd be worse off.
The government did a monumental job of training some 15 million people to do military jobs, during World War II because, there was motivation, there was organization. They attracted talented, serious people who thought they had an important mission.
Well,
it doesn't mean that the government is incapable
of
accomplishing it. It means that you have to go about it in the right way.
No, it's not a question of attracting people. It's a question of drafting them, which is a different thing.
No, the people are motivated to do it. During World War II, even those people who were drafted were motivated. They thought what they were engaged in was worthwhile and important.
Well, okay, but I think we'd be making a gross error if we said that the government was efficient during World War II, or that the government worked smoothly, worked well. The stories I've heard from guys that fought in World War II, guys that worked in the home front in World War II, is that there was gross inefficiency, there was gross waste. The standard term was snafu, and I won't break down on the air what snafu stood for, what the letter stood for.
Well, I think what you were hearing is an exaggeration, and of course I was there and was part of it. Obviously, in anything as large as that, there were, those elements of inefficiency and mismanagement. But the truth is that an enormous job was undertaken, that millions and millions of people were involved. They were trained to do jobs that they had never had any exposure to or experience in. We had, people who were retail clerks who became welders and machinists and ship fitters, and we turned out a tremendous number of ships and tanks and trucks and planes.
There's
and
no shortage of ships
trained
right now.
people to do military jobs. The point is that people can be trained to do those things.
Well, okay, but keep in mind it was still government work, and it was the U.S. government versus the Japanese government and the German government, who were also suffered the same kind of inefficiencies and snafus that our government did. It's interesting to sit down and look at the history of a war, how it was developed on the home front and on the battlefield, and it's just one screw-up after another. And often it appears that the side that wins is the side that makes the least stupid mistakes.
No, I think that's an oversimplification. But what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Given the problem we have of millions of people unemployed and having no likelihood at all, no hope of qualifying for the jobs that will be available for them in the future.
What makes you say that? I totally disagree that they have no ability to qualify for the jobs. I mean, the interesting thing in this country, for the first 175 whatever years after the Declaration of Independence, it was assumed that government did not have to hold people's hand to acquire an occupation. And during most of that time, we had a much lower unemployment rate. In the 60s, it became prominent that government had to train people for jobs. So people, instead of trying to get trained on their own, they relied on the government. And once they did that, we've seen unemployment become far higher after these programs were created.
For most of this country's history, most people were employed in agriculture. Now, like 3% of us are employed in agriculture.
I don't think you could say most of the history. I think after the first half of it, for sure.
Yeah, well, through most of it.
Well,
first half of it,
I'm not
80%
sure.
Or so, and after that, it declining somewhat. But the point is, the training problems didn't exist. We're living in a high-tech society now, a completely different world where training is of far greater importance than it was in the past. Even to be a teamster is something of a different magnitude. It's a serious problem. Do we do something about it? And if we do, what's the role of the government? And if the government stays out of it, what happens to these people?
The thing I have to wonder is that is there any excuse for government training people for some jobs that would not, if the logic was carried forward, would not have government train people for all jobs? And I can't imagine that there's anybody who would want government to train people to work at IBM, for instance.
No, it wouldn't train people to work at IBM, but I can see the government preparing people to work on computers.
Why?
Because
I mean, my God,
it serves the interests of this government, of this society, to have people, most of its members, or as many of its members as possible, being productive.
Which is a good reason not to have government train them, because the people the government trains, we see in study after study after study, acquire bad work habits. They're often given the wrong information. People are trained in the wrong skill.
Well,
there are so many
that's not an
adverse
argument.
effects.
That's not an argument to me that we oughtn't attempt to train them. I think that it's an argument that the programs have been bad, mismanaged, and that we have to, replace them with good programs.
How? I mean, I was looking at these studies. I called up the Department of Labor and asked them how many different job training programs we'd had since 1961. People at the labor didn't even know. I would guess probably at least 40, 50 different programs. There are no shining stars there, and if we've tried this many times and we've had this many sociologists trying to jiggle this and shuffle that, we haven't succeeded, I don't think. It remains.
What do we do with these people, Jim?
Which people?
The people who are unemployed and who are not well enough trained for the jobs that are available.
A lot of these people are unemployed, for instance, because they were involved in previous government job programs. Some are youth programs. I was looking at some of the studies of some different social groups over the periods in the mid-late 1970s when the enrollment was highest, and the same group 5 years later, and the unemployment was much higher among those people, those groups that were most heavily enrolled in summer jobs programs. I think these programs have had a very dire effect on people working in the past. And it might be nice to say if these programs worked, then we should have the programs. But I haven't seen anybody with the right magic wand that'll somehow make them work.
If your argument is that the government involvement with them taints them with failure, maybe they can be contracted out. Maybe the government can pay private educators. Private concerns are able to educate people, to train people to do jobs in their companies, are they not?
Yeah, I think something like that would...
I mean, so that it's possible to train people. It's being done. Maybe we can do it with government money and supervision on a private basis. But the point is, it seems to me to be irresponsible to stand by in the face of such an enormous problem and do nothing.
Well, and likewise, it seems irresponsible to me after we've had 50 programs fail to say, well, for God's sake, the next one has to work, so let's pay for it. I'm in favor of people learning skills. I think the key to people acquiring training is to have a strong economy, because that tends to create demand for training itself. That gives businesses a real incentive to train people for real jobs. You were talking about government training people for government subsidizing private training. There was an interesting study done by Gary Burtless at Brookings Institution recently. There's a targeted jobs tax credit program which gives generous tax credits to employers for hiring job seekers who are low income or unemployed, or young, whatever. Burtless found that the young people, the poor people who were eligible for this program, if they told their employers when they were looking for a job that they were eligible for the federal subsidy, they were much less likely to be hired than if they just went in there on their own and asked to be hired and trained.
Well, let's see what our listeners think about this. 885-8850 is our telephone number, 885-8850. We're talking to James Bovard about the paper that he did for the Cato Institute titled The Failure of Federal Job Training. If you have any questions or comments, we invite them. Call 885-8850 and turn your radio down when you do. Good evening, you're on the air.
Oh, good evening, Mr. Fisk and your guest. I have listened to, many people on your show, and they have come up with the same idea that this gentleman has. They criticize the government program, but they don't seem to have any better ideas to help these poor people. The private industry is not falling over themselves to help train these people. If you live in Washington, take a city like Washington. To be an electrician or a carpenter, you have to get into the union, the program run by the union. How many young minority do you think, say men, are being put into these programs? Very few. So, what is supposed to happen to these people?
Well, the unions in D.C. and most other large cities have too much power, and I think it's very sad they've got a lock on the training for these positions. I'm totally opposed to that. As far as your first point, that the bottom line is the government should not make promises to poor people that it cannot keep. And again, the last 25 years, government has promised poor people that it will give them a skill.
Right.
It hasn't. And CETA was the biggest program of them all.
I hear you.
And study after study shows that CETA hurt the future earnings of both young blacks and young whites in the program.
That is true. But where are the private industries who are, say the government programs are failing, but private industries are not helping either. So somebody has to help. I mean, people need jobs to support their family. Nobody's helping. The unions are not helping. The private industries are not helping. So the government thought they would try to help. If they're not doing such a good job, then somebody else should try to help. And they're not helping. So, these people are just to be left out, on the limb.
Well, if government does more harm than good to these young people, I can't see how they're helping them.
Okay.
Well, then the only remaining conclusion is that nothing should be done.
Exactly.
Wait a minute,
That's what your argument is, that
minute.
nothing should be done. Because
the thing I'm
government
saying,
are not doing a good job, and industry's not helping, so forget the whole thing.
the thing I'm saying is that if government programs don't work, then we should try something else. The answer
What is
again.
your recommendation then?
The answer again is the government should try and get out of the way of private job creation. There's all kinds of disincentives to creating jobs, especially in the district. And the district government's a terror for job creation for small businesses. It's anti-business. That's probably the reason you've got probably twice or 3 times as much unemployment in the district as you do in Fairfax County. But that's another story.
Interestingly,
Interestingly,
his political opponents are
jobs.
charging Marion Barry with being pro-business.
The district
I
creates
don't
jobs.
think
The
that
only
Schwartz
thing
is
it's most of the
charging
people
him
from
that.
Fairfax and other
It
places
could be Brian
that come
Moore
in
is,
and
but
get
he's
the jobs.
far out there. Say
Have
what?
you looked at these buildings that going up downtown? Who are working on these jobs? They're not district residents. In my office, there are about 22 people. Only 3 people live in the district. So jobs are being created in the district. The only thing is that the district residents are not getting the jobs.
Why?
So I wouldn't say it's Barry's fault. It's just the area that people can come from one area and get jobs in another. That's the way it is.
But why are district residents not getting these jobs?
Because if you look downtown, look, the black people you see, men down there, they're laborers. They are not getting these good jobs because most of them, if you look at the jobs, the carpenters, the electricians, most of them are West Indian because they had the chance where they came from to learn these trades. These young men here are not getting the chance to do anything.
Yeah,
besides,
it's interesting.
stand in the street corner.
Okay, but it's interesting. A lot of people I see working on the buildings downtown are from Mexico or El Salvador, Costa Rica, and I don't know where they got their skills. But
They didn't get it I can
wait.
assure you they didn't get it in this country because there are not too many minorities putting these apprentice programs.
Well, I think it's possible to learn it someplace else after the apprentice program.
Ma'am, thank you for your call.
Thank you.
885-8850, good evening. You're on the air for James Bovard.
Hi. It's hard to know where to start because I don't recall your having had a speaker who is so poorly informed but so full of rhetoric, and I'm being polite. Let me start by, first of all, going back to a couple of the statements that are absolutely fascinating in terms of their ignorance. Apparently he doesn't like Roosevelt, and made the statement that the European countries began coming out of the Depression before we did. And that's true. The reason is that he may not recall, he doesn't sound as though he's old enough, and he probably hasn't bothered to read much history. Germany, France, Britain, Low Countries, and of course Soviet Russia, but we're not interested in them, were preparing for war beginning around 33.
France was not preparing for war in 33. The whole trouble, the whole reason.
You're quite wrong. Now,
wait a minute.
You've had a long time to talk. Now, France was building the Maginot Line. They were building the entire area of forts extending up to southern part of Switzerland, and they were heavily involved in putting in place a defensive system which was absolutely ridiculous, but they were spending huge amounts of money on armaments. And so was Germany, as you know. Secondly, the government does not run job programs or training programs. They fund them. And I was involved at Brookings studying programs which were funded at Chrysler, at Inland Steel, at Polaroid. Most of the programs that you keep referring to in a simplistic way as government programs are only government funds which are sent to local areas, as you indicate in the case of the summer program, and you're right criticizing those, but the bulk of the funds under CETA and under MDTA back in the 60s went to the private sector, and
No.
so did PIC, by the
Wrong.
way.
Wrong.
Now, well, you can
Wait a
say it's
minute, hold
wrong,
on,
but
hold on.
there are
There's-
any number of studies that have been done, and I'm intrigued by the use of the word all. I mean, I've never heard anyone who is as simplistic as you are. You're fascinating. I mean, you
Hey.
are a study by yourself.
Hey, I didn't catch your name. You said you were at Brookings?
I had been at Brookings, yes. in
Wait,
the 60s. Would you
didn't-
like my name?
Sure.
Now I'll make it even sporting, because you're inferring I wasn't there. What about a $100 bet?
Wait a minute. Look, I wasn't implying you weren't there. Hold on. But as far as your comment that most of the money on the CETA went to the private sector, it didn't. A lot of the money went to nonprofits.
You wouldn't want to bet on that, would you? Would you? Now, if you want to read some books on CETA and some of the studies that were done at the Urban Institute on CETA as well, you can get a tremendous amount of information rather than the rhetoric you've been handing out. Let me also say this, that on the reports that were done of the experimental and demonstration program at the Department of Labor, the Upjohn Foundation did a number of studies on
Yeah, but they're biased as hell. Wait a minute, hold on. If you're hunting for an objective study, the National Academy of Science study, this came out last fall, October '85, looked at all those studies and concluded that the only programs that possibly helped young people were the Job Corps.
Now, wait a minute. Are you telling me that a government program at CETA helped the young people?
Wait a minute.
I mean, you were saying all programs are no good a little while ago, and everyone heard you. Now you're saying CETA did help, right?
I did not say that at all. You're getting muddled there, fella.
I'm not muddled. I'm not muddled. Let me, Fred. Let me just say a word
Yeah.
about an alternative. The point you make that we do have individuals who are increasingly technologically unemployed, and probably the most successful approach was the approach begun in West Germany in 1969, when West German industry, in cooperation with the government, set up a new program as an entitlement, which provided as a right to every German citizen, whether they were employed or unemployed, up to 2 years of retraining with a stipend inversely related to the last wage. And I did a study in Germany this was in 69, I did my study in 71, 72, 73, and found that German industry, Siemens, a number of the major firms, including Mercedes, Benz, found that this provided a mechanism for constantly, consistently upgrading about 2% of the labor force each year and providing them with the individuals who had the skills that were necessary. Now, we haven't done anything like that. As a matter of fact, what's interesting is your speaker at one point responded when you said, well, what are we going to do with all these unemployed? And he said, well, most of these unemployed are people who are in these government training programs. Now,
Who were in the training programs?
Actually, what you do, you can put the kibosh on that very quickly. The MDTA and the CETA never accounted for more than between 1/10 and 1/2 of 1% of our labor force.
No, true.
We have about 7% unemployed now.
Not true.
It is true. It is true. you can say it's not true all you want, but basically, what your problem is that apparently I don't know much about your background, but apparently you're very anti-government. Period. No matter what. Matter of fact, I resent the fact, since I was in World War II and I also worked in industry, that you've drawn a picture of World War II as though we were a bunch of clowns falling over each other on assembly lines or on the front lines, and that the only reason that we came out of the war as we did is because the Japanese and the Germans were even bigger clowns than we were. I think you're an insult to a lot of the people's intelligence who are listening tonight.
Well, it sounds like you're very sensitive. But hold on.
That's right, because I was involved.
Hold on. There was something you were commenting on what a wonderful program Germany had a few minutes ago. And I just got back from Germany a few weeks ago, and they've had very high unemployment there throughout the 1980s. Mm-hmm. Now, if that's your idea of a success,
oh no. In logic, we refer to that really as reasoning. Well, I don't want to use a Latin, but basically, the unemployment in Germany is a result of a number of very complex forces, and what they're doing, I think, is beginning to confront the fact that they have had very high production costs. They've rationalized in a direction in terms of moving to machinery to displace labor, because labor has been very high cost. The union agreements they've had have pushed labor costs up very high, and they've had a high rate of unemployment. Now, that's the problem, and they're beginning to turn that around, but very slowly. However, as Fred indicated, when you look at productivity, now we're talking about competitive ability on a world market basis, German productivity has been substantially higher. As a matter of fact, our productivity now is back down to around, it's less than 0.5%. We're back down close to zero in terms of total service and manufacturing productivity. So that we're back in trouble again in terms of being able to compete in terms of productivity gain per year.
Well, there's more to that number than that, because we've had a huge, the time that Germany's had no new jobs created, we've had a huge number of new workers come into the labor force.
Just a minute.
Having new workers come in the labor force is going to throw off.
Let me give you a figure on that. As a matter of fact, the rate of new jobs created 2 years following our 81-82 recession as a percent is less than the rate of new job creation following the last 2 recessions in the United States. You see, the game that's being played by the Reagan administration is they use absolute numbers. What you have to use are percentages, and the rate of gain in new jobs in the United States, it's a big economy, we've got a big labor force, is less than the rate of gains that we achieved following the last 2 recessions.
What is the rate of gain of jobs in Britain, France, and Germany? What is the rate?
I haven't followed that.
Zero.
And by the way,
Zero.
I'm not just comparing the rate of
Zero.
jobs. Now, just a moment. I'm not, you see, I'm not a Johnny One-Note. What you're doing is you're looking for one item, and you're trying to hang all of your arguments on that because you're assuming that people are simple enough so that they're going to say, oh, well, that's the whole game. An economy is very complex, far more than we can discuss tonight, unfortunately. But what you're looking at is rate of growth of GNP, you're looking at price stability, you're looking at job creation, you're looking at unemployment rates, and you're looking at productivity, and you're looking at price stability. And when you take all of those indicators, then you begin to find that the U.S. economy, with all those indicators, is not doing as well as the economies of Japan, France, and Germany.
One of the things that troubles me is that, true that private industry trains its own people and trains them well, but they don't bother with the most disadvantaged.
Correct.
And that is where the sore point is. That's where what society has to be concerned with.
Yeah. Fred?
Well, but again, going back to these CETA studies, these major studies by the Urban Institute and other groups that show that these programs had overall net negative effects on the enrollees. These studies were comparing the group of enrollees who enroll in CETA and a control group had the same traits, same circumstances to start with, but did not enroll in CETA.
That's wrong.
And, wait a minute. And the thing that they found out was that the people that enrolled did worse than those who were not supposedly helped at all by the government.
Fred?
Yeah.
I disagree. The Urban Institute studies on a Job Corps and the Urban Institute studies on the CETA programs and the data that was forthcoming from the OIC programs, there were over 90 cities that had OIC, Opportunity Industrialization Centers, that were started by the Reverend Sullivan up in Philadelphia, are contrary to that. But let me pick up on the point you're making.
It's the National Academy of Science report. Did you? It sounds like you haven't seen that report. Well, then perhaps you aren't.
I'll get a hold of it, but
then perhaps you should stop acting like you're so omniscient.
Pardon me?
Perhaps you should stop acting so omniscient.
Oh, no.
Like a highfalutin expert.
That's the only study that I admit to having not seen of the ones that you're talking about. And the ones that you've referred to, as a matter of fact, from my recollection, the research I've done, the books I've published 5 books and 80 articles, and very little of what you're saying rings true. I'm not saying you're dishonest. I'm not sure what you are, but you're coming up with some very odd conclusions in terms of studies that have been done by the Sawyers, in terms of studies that have been done by Brookings, in terms of studies that have been done by the CED.
Hey, hold on. The stuff done by Gary Burtless at Brookings, how much of that have you seen?
Let me just...
Wait a minute. Wait, just give me a yes or no. A yes or no. How much of Burtless's stuff have you seen at Brookings? How much of it have you seen?
I've seen most of his stuff, and much of what you're ascribing to him is either taken out of context or it doesn't reach the conclusions as I recall them. So I'm
wait, hold on.
I've
got in front of me here a Brookings reprint number T029.
Well, I'd have to get it.
That's spiritless untargeted wage subsidies. Have you seen that?
I'd have to go to my office and
have you seen that?
Yes.
Okay, well then I'm quoting from him. His results were that the people that came to employers and said they were government subsidized got treated worse than the people who were in the same situation who said they had no government subsidy. Is that clear cut or is it not?
No, it's not clear cut because earlier in the text.
Bertless thought it was.
No, it's not because earlier in the text he cites in greater detail the samples, and he cites some of the other data that really have to be you really have to ask questions about. So I'm not prepared to accept that.
Yeah.
I mean, if I had the time, I'd get the study
Hold on.
in the office
Okay.
and deal with it.
Hold on.
Fred,
Wait a minute.
Fred,
let me make one other
point.
point.
Go ahead, one sentence.
Yeah.
Fred, let me make one other. For example, Chrysler had a major training contract in the 60s, and so did Inland Steel. And one of the efforts was to get them to hire and train people on the job who were lacking literacy skills. And they were very frank. They were very honest. They said, look, this isn't our cup of tea, okay? This isn't what we do well. And we don't think that we should be asked to do this. And they pulled out of that contract. And I understood it. I was involved at the time. I wasn't in government either. I was with a foundation. And one of the problems you have now, a serious one, is we're beginning to face up finally to the fact that we have a very large percentage of our labor force, people over 16, who are functionally illiterate. And they are not only unemployed, they are truly unemployable. And we have people like Barbara Bush, who for several years has been talking about this. And we're beginning even to get the U.S. Bureau of the Census beginning to upgrade their estimates. 2 years ago, they said that, hell, it was only 1% of the people who were illiterate. Now, they're up to around 12 or 14%, not too far from the 20 to 30% that some of the Texas studies came up with a few years ago and a Ford Foundation study. So that the real problem now is how do we get funds out into our system so that we can begin to reach the adults who are illiterate and the young people who are still in the pipeline, who are not being given literacy and computer skills. Because without those skills, there's just no way that these people are trainable for the jobs that are available.
Hey, listen, thank you very, very much for your contribution.
Not at all. Thank you.
Well, here's somebody who says he's been in these programs monitoring for years and years and years, but the fact is most of these programs have been failures, the CEDAR program especially, and I would think this person, if he was as prominent as he implied that he was, holds some of the responsibility for the failure of these programs.
Okay. Good evening. You're on 88.5 FM.
Hi, Fred. How are you?
Fine.
I happened to work on Capitol Hill at the time of the CEDA program, and I can tell you that was one of the most corrupt things that I ever saw. It was the result of a really unholy alliance of special interests. It included the people who expected to be recipients of the largesse in terms of potential employees. It included the industries who expected the government to provide trained workers for them, administrators who would administer the program, and then the members of Congress themselves who expected to gain politically by arranging for CEDA employees in their districts. And I think the basic point is this: industry only hires people not out of trying to be good citizens, but because they need work done. And so it's not at all unreasonable, it seems to me, to say to industry, look, if you want to hire people, and you obviously need to have them trained, you take care of training them. The only thing that happens when the government does it, the money to do the government training doesn't descend from the heavens, is that it generally means misallocation and higher costs.
Sounds bullseye to me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. You're on the air.
Yes. One thing that struck me about the gentleman's arguments tonight is correlation does not necessarily mean causation. And he has not really, at least I was not able to listen for the last 20 minutes, but he has not come up with arguments that demonstrate a mechanism by which these job programs cause unemployment. And that's something that I have a problem with his argument.
Okay, my argument is not that they cause unemployment, but that in general they have either no beneficial effects or negative effects. In the sense that people enroll in government job programs who otherwise would have had jobs in the private sector, as happened very often under CETA, then it was people were doing make-work jobs instead of real jobs that were creating some value for somebody.
I don't know. I personally was able to enroll in a CETA program, which I did not go all the way through. But
Why?
Because most of the people in the program, I was in North Idaho, and culturally I was alienated. Most of them came from the ghetto in North Philadelphia, and I just did not feel at home in that environment.
Why? Did it seem like there was not a good work environment, or
no?
what was the problem there?
I just did not have anything in common with the people I was there with.
Yeah,
most of them were high school dropouts. Most of them, talking to them, had no jobs previous to that, had led really dead-end existences. A large part of them had come there as an alternative to going to reform school.
Wow, great.
But to look at those people and say that they were these highly employable people who are going to go out there and grab jobs, I just couldn't see it then, and I can't see it now.
Yeah, the thing I wonder, was the training program good, though, there?
They seem to be filled they were learning their skills. They were being taught carpentry, and among other things. And a large part of the reason that a lot of them had trouble learning is that there were some really disruptive characters in there. And it was the biggest complaints I got as far as the learning environment. And that's just one isolated center. I can't speak for the program as a whole. But I don't know that. I don't know that your statistics point out that these people would have gone out and gotten other jobs other places. There might be a lot of other factors involved in this that those statistics don't bring out. A lot of other sociological factors.
Well, I'm assuming the studies, again, done by Urban Institute and other places and evaluated by the National Academy of Science, I assume that they had some good control groups for those studies.
Well, I don't know if you can make those assumptions. I work in a technical field, and we make assumptions that end up really flooring us in the long run a lot of times. And I don't know that you can make assumptions like that without really reading the studies and seeing exactly how they're done. And I don't know how they were done, and I don't know what the controls were.
Yeah,
and
most.
You're saying that I assume they do, does not mean that they did.
Okay, true. Most studies done in this field by private scholars, very often the studies are done by people who are working as government consultants. They're shoddy as hell. They're biased, but the National Academy of Science said these studies were reliable.
Got to interrupt. Our time has run out. Jim, once again, you've put your finger on an interesting and a controversial subject.
I try. Thanks.
James Bovard, his paper for Cato, The Failure of Federal Job Training. Well, we have some very beautiful weather in this area, but in other parts of the country, they're into the winter season. Winter storm warnings for heavy snow in parts of central Wyoming tonight and tomorrow, and other parts of that part of the country. Coming up on As It Happens, a female Soviet poet is released from imprisonment in her own country. The story coming up next. Have a nice weekend. On Monday night, I'll be talking to James Burke